January 17th, 1943, Vickers Armstrong Engineering Works, Newcastle upon Tyne, England. The wind cuts across the Tyne River like a blade forged in the North Sea's breath. Inside a cavernous warehouse that smells of grease, welded steel and damp English winter, a peculiar sight takes shape beneath industrial lamps that cast long shadows on concrete floors. A Churchill infantry tank, 39 tons of riveted British determination, sits motionless on wooden blocks. But surrounding its hull, like some mad seamstress's creation, is a billowing skirt of rubberized canvas, a collapsible screen that rises nearly 6 feet above the tank's turret, transforming the armored beast into something that resembles a child's bathtub toy more than an instrument of war. Nicholas Straussler, a Hungarian-born engineer with wire-rimmed spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, circles the contraption with the intensity of a sculptor examining his most controversial work. His hands, stained with oil and marked by a lifetime of mechanical obsession, trace the canvas folds as if reading Braille. Behind him, a cluster of British military officers stand with arms crossed, faces betraying the peculiar British mixture of skepticism and desperate hope that characterized those dark middle years of the war. They have witnessed 3 years of retreat, disaster, and improvisation. They have seen the best of British engineering fail spectacularly on French beaches and Norwegian fjords. Now they are being asked to believe in a floating tank. The canvas screen is Straussler's answer to an impossible problem. It is held erect by compressed air, creating a displacement chamber that, in theory, always in theory, will allow a 30-ton armored vehicle to float in seawater like a cork. Twin propellers mounted at the rear, powered by the tank's own engine, will push it through the waves at a glacial 5 miles per hour. The entire apparatus can be collapsed in 15 seconds once the tank reaches shallow water, allowing the crew to fight as if they had driven off solid ground. It is engineering madness distilled into canvas and compressed air. It is desperation wearing the mask of innovation. Straussler knows what the Germans will think. He has spent enough time in continental engineering circles before the war to understand the Teutonic mind, its love of precision, its worship of tested doctrine, its contempt for improvisation that smells of desperation. He can imagine their laughter echoing through the design bureaus of Krupp and Porsche, through the halls of the Wehrmacht's Ordnance Office, through every beer hall where German engineers gather to mock the declining creativity of their enemies. A floating tank. Schwimmender Panzer. The phrase itself sounds like a punchline waiting to happen, but Straussler is not German. He carries the improvisational spirit of Central Europe, the Hungarian ability to make something from nothing, to see possibilities where others see only the limits of convention. And Britain in 1943 is a nation that has learned, through bitter necessity, that survival belongs not to those with the best textbook solutions, but to those willing to embrace the absurd if it offers even a glimmer of tactical advantage. The test will come soon. The canvas tank will be driven into the Tyne's cold waters. It will either float or sink, like the expensive coffin it might become. But on this January afternoon, as pale light filters through warehouse windows and the distant sounds of Newcastle's shipyards hammer the air with the rhythm of a nation building its way toward vengeance, the floating tank exists in that liminal space between mockery and miracle, waiting for history to render its verdict. The German understanding of amphibious warfare in 1943 rested on foundations of concrete experience and doctrinal certainty. They had watched the British Expeditionary Force flee from Dunkirk's beaches in a chaotic evacuation that, despite its propaganda transformation into a miracle of deliverance, remained fundamentally a military disaster. They had observed the failed Dieppe raid in August 1942, where Canadian and British forces were slaughtered on French beaches with methodical German efficiency. Of the 6,000 men who landed, fewer than half returned, and not a single tank made it off the beach intact. The lessons seemed clear, carved in blood and validated by tactical doctrine refined through 2 years of coastal defense preparation. Amphibious assault, the Germans understood, was a problem of the approach. Defenders enjoyed every advantage. Prepared positions, interlocking fields of fire, obstacles placed with geometric precision in the killing zones between high and low tide. Attackers arrived exhausted, disoriented, seasick, their heavy equipment waterlogged or abandoned in deep water. Infantry wading ashore became targets in a shooting gallery. Tanks loaded onto landing craft became steel tombs if the vessels struck mines or were hit by shore batteries before reaching the beach. The mathematics of amphibious warfare favored the defender so overwhelmingly that any rational military mind would conclude such operations were exercises in organized suicide. This understanding shaped the Atlantic Wall, that grandiose name given to the system of bunkers, obstacles, and artillery positions stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. By 1943, the wall consumed more concrete than any construction project in human history. Millions of cubic meters poured into fortifications designed by the Todt organization with Teutonic thoroughness. Rommel, appointed to command the defensive preparations in late 1943, brought the urgency of a man who had seen what modern firepower could do to exposed forces. He demanded more obstacles, more mines, more concentrated firepower in the crucial 100 yards between the waterline and the first line of dunes. His philosophy was simple: destroy the invasion on the beaches in the first hour before the attackers could establish any foothold. Everything depended on those first moments when men struggled from the sea onto the killing grounds, prepared with such meticulous care. In this context, German engineers viewed Allied tank development with professional interest but fundamental contempt. They had seen American and British armor on the battlefields of North Africa and Italy. The American M4 Sherman tank, produced in quantities that bordered on the obscene, represented everything German engineers found simultaneously impressive and inferior about American industrial methods. The Sherman was mechanically reliable, easy to maintain, simple enough that conscript crews could operate it with minimal training. But it was also undergunned, under-armored, and prone to catastrophic fires when penetrated, a weakness that earned it the grim nickname Ronson among British crews. After the cigarette lighter that lights every time, German tankers called them Tommy Cookers, a reference to the British Army's portable stoves and the horrific speed with which Shermans burned when hit by German 75mm or 88mm shells. The Panther and Tiger tanks that German industry produced represented a different philosophy entirely. They were over-engineered masterpieces, complex to the point of mechanical neurosis, expensive in both materials and production time. But they were undeniably superior in almost every measurable category of armored combat. A single Tiger tank with its 80mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the American tank's 75mm shells bounced off like thrown stones. The armor thickness ratios were obscene: 4 inches of frontal armor on the Tiger versus less than 3 on the Sherman. German tankers who survived encounters with Allied armor spoke with the casual confidence of men who knew their technical superiority was measured, documented, and mathematically certain. So when intelligence reports began filtering into German headquarters about Allied experiments with swimming tanks and other specialized armor for amphibious operations, the reaction was predictable. In the officers' messes and engineering bureaus, the concept provoked knowing smiles and ironic toasts. The Americans and British, it seemed, were so desperate to solve the Beach problem that they had resorted to fantasy engineering. Tanks that floated, tanks that laid roadways, tanks that threw explosive charges. It was the behavior of a militarily inferior power trying to compensate for tactical weakness with gadgetry and gimmicks. The Germans had experimented with amphibious vehicles, certainly. The Schwimmwagen and the larger Schwimmkübel served reconnaissance roles. But a swimming tank, a 30-ton armored vehicle that somehow floated on canvas and wishful thinking? It violated fundamental principles of displacement, waterproofing, and mechanical reliability. It was, in the assessment of men who had designed the Ferdinand and the Maus, the kind of desperate improvisation that confirmed Allied inferiority in the engineering disciplines that mattered. The mockery was not merely professional skepticism. It represented a deeper ideological certainty. The German military-industrial complex saw itself as the inheritor of a great tradition. Prussian discipline merged with industrial modernity, producing weapons systems that were intellectually superior to anything the mongrel democracies could create. American mass production was impressive in its scale, certainly, but it lacked the refinement, the attention to detail, the philosophical commitment to quality over quantity that defined German engineering culture. That America could produce 50,000 tanks, while Germany produced 5,000 was a fact acknowledged with concern, but also with contempt. 100 inferior tanks would still die before a single superior one. This was the calculus that German officers repeated like a catechism. Even as the mathematics of attrition began tilting against them, the floating tank became, in German military circles, a symbol of Allied desperation dressed as innovation. It was discussed with the same tone that men use when describing a competitor's embarrassing failure, a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Let them waste resources on floating tanks. Let them complicate their logistics with specialized vehicles that would undoubtedly fail under combat conditions. The Germans would wait behind their concrete and steel, their guns calibrated and their fire plans rehearsed, ready to demonstrate once again that good defense, good positioning, and superior equipment would always triumph over gimmickry. What the German engineers could not see, wrapped in their certainty and their undeniable technical expertise, was that they were preparing to fight the wrong kind of battle. They understood the calculus of firepower and armor thickness. They had mastered the geometry of defensive positions, but they had not grasped the emerging American way of war, a philosophy that accepted higher casualties, embraced imperfect solutions, and compensated for technical inferiority with overwhelming material superiority and operational flexibility. The Germans were playing chess with masters who had decided to flip the board, change the rules, and simply drown them in pieces until victory became statistically inevitable. The floating tank was not a sign of desperation. It was a sign of something far more dangerous: pragmatic indifference to elegance, willingness to accept absurd solutions to immediate problems, and the industrial capacity to implement those solutions at scale. But in early 1943, as the canvas screens were tested in English rivers and the Sherman hulls were modified in American factories, the German engineers did not yet understand what was coming. They laughed at the floating tanks because laughter felt appropriate, because their worldview, their training, their entire professional identity demanded that they laugh at such obvious folly. They would not be laughing on the morning of June 6, 1944. The transformation of the Sherman tank into the DD duplex drive, though everyone simply called them Donald Ducks or swimming Shermans, represented a collision between British improvisation and American industrial capacity. The canvas screen developed by Nicholas Straussler could theoretically be adapted to any tank hull, but the Allies needed a platform that combined reliability, availability, and sufficient firepower to matter in the crucial first hours of an amphibious assault. The Sherman, for all its flaws, fit those requirements perfectly. By late 1943, American factories were producing them at a rate approaching 2,000 per month. They were mechanically simple enough that modifications could be implemented without disrupting production schedules. And they were already the standard medium tank for both American and British forces, meaning crews were trained, spare parts were available, and the logistical tail was already in place. The engineering modifications were surprisingly modest, which was precisely the point. The Sherman's hull was welded rather than riveted, reducing potential leak points. A collapsible canvas screen, 36 feet in circumference when erected, was mounted on a framework that bolted to the hull just above the track line. When raised using compressed air, this screen extended the tank's displacement enough to achieve buoyancy. Barely. The Sherman DD floated with only 2 feet of freeboard, meaning that in anything rougher than a flat calm, waves would wash over the canvas like water over a bathtub's edge. 2 small propellers, mounted on a frame at the rear and connected to the tank's drive system through a power takeoff, provided propulsion at roughly 4 miles per hour in still water, slower in currents, slower still in choppy seas. The crew learned to operate in conditions that violated every instinct of armored warfare. Inside the DD Sherman, buttoned up as it wallowed through the waves, the tankers existed in a peculiar sensory hell. The engine roared behind them, its vibrations transmitted through every rivet and weld. The canvas screen blocked all outward vision, except for a narrow slit at the commander's position. Water sloshed and slapped against the fabric with sounds that convinced every man aboard that sinking was imminent. The tank pitched and rolled with wave action, creating nausea in men who had trained for ground combat, not naval operations. Ventilation was minimal. The smell of gasoline fumes, hydraulic fluid, and vomit became the standard atmosphere. Training began in the calm waters of English rivers and Scottish lochs, then progressed to the progressively rougher conditions of coastal waters. Men drowned during training. Tanks sank when canvas ripped or when waves swamped the minimal freeboard. Crews developed superstitions and techniques. They learned to gauge wave action by sound alone, to sense when the tank was losing buoyancy, to execute the 15-second screen collapse procedure with the speed of men who knew their lives depended on reaching shallow water. They practiced beach landings until the choreography became instinct. The moment the tracks touched bottom, the driver gunned the engine while the commander triggered the compressed air release, the canvas screen collapsing around the hull like a flower folding at dusk. The transformation from wallowing bathtub toy to functional fighting vehicle taking place as German machine guns searched for their position. The GI American tank crews, who trained on the DD Shermans, approached the concept with typical GI pragmatism, a mixture of dark humor, mechanical competence, and fatalistic acceptance. These were men who had grown up during the Depression, who had learned from childhood that making do with imperfect tools was a survival skill, not a character flaw. They christened their vehicles with names that reflected both affection and ironic distance. Donald Duck, Water Buffalo, Sinker Smith, Amphibious Abomination. They wrote letters home, describing their training in terms that deliberately downplayed the danger. Learning to drive a boat that thinks it's a tank, or working on my swimming army style. But they also understood, with the clarity that soldiers develop when their lives depend on equipment functioning as promised, that the DD Sherman represented their best chance of getting off the beach alive. The British crews who trained alongside them brought a different cultural context to the same mission. They had survived Dunkirk, had seen what happened when infantry hit defended beaches without armor support. They had lost friends at Dieppe, where the Churchill tanks never made it past the seawall, where Canadian soldiers died by the hundreds in the shadow of immobilized armor that might as well have been monuments to military failure. For British tankers, the DD Sherman was not a joke or an improvisation. It was a chance to correct the equation, to provide covering fire during those crucial first minutes when an amphibious assault either succeeds or collapses into massacre. By spring 1944, as the invasion force assembled in southern England, the DD Sherman battalions had achieved an unusual level of proficiency in a fundamentally unnatural mode of warfare. They could launch from landing craft 2,000 yards offshore, navigate to the beach using compass and visual references, arrive with enough combat effectiveness to suppress pillboxes and machine gun nests during the infantry's most vulnerable moments. The success rate during training exercises hovered around 70%, 30% of the tanks would founder, swamp, or experience mechanical failure before reaching the beach. To conventional military planners, a 30% loss rate before even engaging the enemy would be unacceptable. But amphibious warfare operated under different mathematics. If 7 out of 10 DD Shermans reached the beach and provided covering fire, they would save more lives than if conventional. Tanks landed later from specialized craft that had to reach the shallows. The German observers who monitored Allied training exercises through intelligence reports and aerial reconnaissance noted the existence of these specialized vehicles with professional interest but no particular alarm. Modified tanks for beach landings were sensible enough. Every military faced the same problem of getting armor ashore during the vulnerable approach phase. The intelligence summaries filed away in Wehrmacht headquarters acknowledged the DD Sherman's existence in the same tone that a scientist might note a competitor's interesting but probably impractical experimental approach. The assumption, built on years of tactical doctrine and combat experience, was that any amphibious assault would face its moment of truth when the landing craft reached the shallows and began unloading troops and vehicles into the concentrated fire of prepared defenses. That the Allies might launch tanks from 2,000 yards offshore, that these tanks might actually reach the beach in sufficient numbers to matter, that they might arrive ahead of the infantry rather than behind them. These possibilities existed outside the German defensive planning framework. They had prepared for the battle they expected. The battle that doctrine and experience taught them was inevitable. What neither the German defenders nor the Allied planners could fully anticipate was how the interaction between human factors and mechanical systems would play out. Under the specific conditions of June 6, 1944, the DD Sherman was a marginal system under ideal conditions, a platform that worked in calm seas, with trained crews, with careful coordination. On the morning of the invasion, none of those conditions would apply completely. The English Channel would be rougher than doctrine allowed. Crews would be exhausted, seasick, disoriented by the largest amphibious operation in human history unfolding around them. Coordination would break down under the friction of combat, that inevitable gap between plan and execution that Clausewitz had identified as the essence of war's uncertainty. The floating tanks that the German engineers had dismissed with knowing smiles would arrive at Normandy, carrying not just their 75mm guns and compressed air screens, but the accumulated weight of Allied desperation, American industrial capacity, British tactical experience, and the simple, bloody-minded determination of men who understood they were riding absurdity into history. Whether they would float or sink, succeed or fail, justify the mockery, or redeem the concept, those questions would be answered on a stretch of French beach that had been converted into the most heavily defended killing ground in human history. The canvas screens were folded and ready. The propellers were tested and greased. The crews had written their letters home and made their peace with probability. All that remained was the crossing, that dark passage through channel waters toward a coast where concrete bunkers waited with mathematical patience, where German gunners had measured ranges and calibrated their weapons for exactly this moment, where the question of whether a tank could float would be resolved with finality that erased all academic doubt. June 6, 1944, 05:30 hours. 6 miles offshore from Omaha Beach. The English Channel is the color of old iron under a sky that cannot decide between darkness and dawn. The landing craft, LCT 547, pitches in swells that are higher than doctrine allows, higher than training prepared them for. Inside the craft's open well, 4 Sherman DD tanks sit in water that sloshes around the tracks with each wave. The canvas screens are already erected, transforming each tank into a fragile fabric castle that shivers and shakes with the landing craft's motion. The crews are inside their vehicles, hatches sealed, existing in the peculiar suspended state of men who have passed beyond fear into a kind of functional numbness. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, commander of the second tank in line, can see nothing through his vision slit except grey canvas and greyer sky. The radio crackles with transmissions from the flotilla, hundreds of vessels converging on a 5-mile stretch of French coast, but the specific words are lost in static and the overwhelming mechanical symphony of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The smell inside the tank is what he will remember later. If there is a later vomit and cordite and the peculiar metallic tang of fear sweat, all mixed with gasoline fumes and the wet canvas smell that reminds him absurdly of Boy Scout camping trips in Wisconsin. A lifetime ago, when the world made sense, the landing craft's ramp drops at 05:45 hours, 2,000 yards from the beach, farther than doctrine recommends. But the Navy officers are terrified of German shore batteries and mines, and they have already seen 2 landing craft explode into orange fireballs as they approach the shore. Mitchell's tank driver, a kid from Pittsburgh named Kowalski, who has never driven anything more complex than a delivery truck before the Army taught him to operate 30 tons of steel, guns the engine and drives forward. The moment of transition from the relative solidity of the landing craft deck into the open ocean is everything the training warned them about and nothing like they imagined. The tank nosedives into a wave trough, and for 3 seconds that feel like geological ages. They are underwater, blind. The engine screaming as the propellers catch water and bite, and somehow, impossibly, they are moving forward. Wallowing like a drunk hippopotamus, but moving. "We're floating," Kowalski says over the intercom, his voice pitched high with the kind of hysterical relief that men feel when absurdity proves functional. Holy Mary, Mother of God, we're actually floating. Mitchell can see almost nothing through his commander's slit. Just grey water and grey sky, and occasionally the dark shapes of other tanks, of the landing craft, the vast mechanical organism of the invasion fleet executing its choreographed approach to the most heavily defended beach in Europe. The tank rocks and pitches. Water slaps the canvas screen with sounds like sporadic applause. The compass reads 090 degrees, due east toward France, toward the beach, toward the German guns that are certainly already ranging on the approaching fleet. The propellers push them forward at what feels like geological speed, 4 miles per hour against current and wind, the engine roaring behind them as if the Sherman is furious at being turned into a boat. 30 seconds after launch, Mitchell's tank is still afloat. 1 minute, 2 minutes. He begins to believe they might actually reach the beach. Then he sees the 3rd tank in their line, Sergeant Rodriguez's command, suddenly settle in the water as if an invisible hand is pushing it down. The canvas screen folds inward. The tank nose goes vertical, turret pointing at the sky like a drowning man's hand, and then it is gone, sinking into the grey channel waters with terrifying speed. Mitchell screams into the radio, but there is no response. Only static and the crackle of other voices reporting other disasters. Other tanks foundering in seas that are too rough for canvas and wishful thinking. "Keep going," Mitchell tells Kowalski. "Though it is unnecessary, there is nowhere to go but forward or down. And stopping is just sinking with better planning." The tank wallows onward. Mitchell begins counting seconds, then minutes. 3 minutes afloat. 5 minutes, 7. The beach is a dark line on the horizon, growing with painful slowness. He can see the bluffs behind it now, can see the grey concrete geometry of the German bunkers built into the hillside with Teutonic precision. No firing yet. The Germans are waiting, letting the invasion fleet come closer, entering the killing zones that have been prepared with such methodical care. At 9 minutes, with the beach perhaps 1,000 yards distant, Mitchell hears a sound that has no place in the catalogue of mechanical noises he has learned to interpret. It is a tearing sound, sharp and final, and immediately the tank begins listing to port. The canvas screen has ripped, torn by the strain, or pierced by floating debris, or simply failed after asking fabric to do what only steel should attempt. Water pours over the frame. The tank settles deeper, the freeboard that was already minimal now reduced to inches. Beach! Mitchell screams into the intercom. Get us to the beach, Kowalski, now, full throttle. The driver obeys, with the panic of a man who can feel 30 tons of steel losing its improbable argument with physics. The engine howls. The propellers thrash. The tank plows forward through water that is now washing over the turret, filling the canvas enclosure, dragging them down with the inexorable patience of gravity asserting its authority over engineering hubris. 600 yards from the beach. 500. Mitchell can see individual obstacles now, the Belgian gates and Czech hedgehogs that Rommel has ordered planted at the tide line. Steel geometry designed to rip the bottoms from landing craft, 400 yards, and the tank is more submarine than surface vessel. Only the turret still above water, the canvas screen completely flooded. Mitchell makes the calculation that will either save them or kill them faster. He triggers the emergency screen release. The compressed air cylinders fire with a hiss that is lost in the engine roar, and the entire canvas framework collapses, falling away from the tank like shed skin. Now they are a turret and gun barrel protruding from the grey water, an armoured submarine with no buoyancy beyond whatever air remains trapped in the hull. 300 yards. The tracks touch bottom, soft sand, no traction, the tank wallowing and sliding. 200 yards and the tracks finally bite. The Sherman lurches forward, water streaming from every hatch and vision port. The engine coughing but still running, still pulling them toward the beach with the mechanical determination that justifies every crude joke American engineers made about German over-engineering. 100 yards, and they are in waist-deep water, the tank finally functioning as it was designed to function, a ground vehicle, a platform for the 75mm gun, a steel box that protects its crew from everything except direct hits. Mitchell opens his hatch and stands in the commander's position. The sensory shock of the world outside the tank is overwhelming. The beach is a hellscape of fire and steel. The bluffs are alive with muzzle flashes, German machine guns and artillery firing in coordinated symphony. The water around them erupts in geysers where mortar rounds impact. Landing craft burn like floating funeral pyres. Bodies drift in the surf, some moving, most not. The sound is not sound anymore, but a physical pressure, a solid wall of noise that eliminates thought and reduces existence to instinct and training. But Mitchell's tank is on the beach, and its 75mm gun is functional, and through the smoke and chaos, he can see a German machine gun nest, perhaps 200 yards inland, firing in long, disciplined bursts into the landing craft, disgorging infantry at the waterline. He taps Kowalski's helmet, the signal, and the driver angles the tank toward the bunker. The gunner, a former farmhand from Iowa named Peterson, who has never missed a target during training, has already identified the threat. The Sherman's main gun traverses with hydraulic smoothness. Peterson fires. The high-explosive shell strikes the bunker's firing slit with the precision of a surgical instrument. The machine gun falls silent. The German crew inside is dead or stunned, or too shocked to continue functioning. It doesn't matter which. What matters is that for perhaps 30 seconds, that corridor of beach is no longer subject to interlocking machine gun fire, and in that 30 seconds, a squad of infantry makes it from the waterline to the sea wall. The first meaningful advance on Omaha Beach's easy red sector. Mitchell's tank is not alone. To his left, he can see two more Shermans emerging from the surf, water streaming from their hulls, their canvas screens collapsed around them like discarded chrysalises. They are early. They have arrived ahead of the main armor waves, ahead of schedule, ahead of the plan. The DD Shermans that the German engineers dismissed as floating absurdities are on the beach, and they are functioning. And they are providing the covering fire that might make the difference between invasion and massacre. In the German bunkers built into the bluffs above Omaha Beach, the defensive plan is already disintegrating. The plan assumed that armor would arrive late, if at all. that the critical first hour would see infantry struggling through obstacles and fighting from the waterline with small arms and courage. The presence of Sherman tanks firing from the beach itself, suppressing positions, destroying obstacles, drawing fire away from the vulnerable infantry. This was outside the anticipated sequence. The German gunners adjust, retarget, engage the tanks with everything from machine guns to 88mm artillery. Some DD Shermans die immediately, burning from direct hits. Others bog in the sand. But enough survive, enough keep fighting, enough provide those crucial minutes of covering fire that allow infantry to move beyond the waterline killing zone. Staff Sergeant Robert. Mitchell's tank fights for 43 minutes before an 88mm shell penetrates the turret armor and ends the war for Kowalski. For Peterson, for the two other crew members whose names will be engraved on a memorial in a small Wisconsin town where people will wonder, decades later, what their sacrifice meant. Mitchell survives with burns and a concussion, and he will spend the rest of his life unable to explain to civilians what it meant to ride a floating tank into Normandy, the absurdity and terror and pride all mixed together into something that transcends language. But on that morning, in those first hours when the entire invasion balanced on the edge of disaster or triumph, the DD Shermans that German engineers had dismissed with smiles and technical superiority achieved exactly what their designers had intended. They got armor onto the beach when it mattered most. They provided covering fire during the most vulnerable phase of the assault. They survived in sufficient numbers to make a tactical difference that measured in lives saved and ground gained. They floated against probability and doctrine and the sneering certainty of men who knew better. The floating tanks floated, and then they fought, and then they died or survived according to the brutal mathematics that govern combat. But they had already justified their existence in those first minutes, when the question was not whether the tanks were elegant or technically impressive, but simply whether they would arrive in time to matter. The German defenders, firing from their concrete positions, could not understand what they were seeing. Tanks emerging from the water itself, appearing through the smoke and surf ahead of schedule, ahead of the anticipated sequence. It violated the defensive plan. It disrupted the carefully calibrated fire sequences. It introduced chaos into a battle that was supposed to follow predictable patterns of approach, killing zone, and repulse. The mockery that German engineers had expressed toward the floating tanks died on Omaha Beach, along with thousands of men from both sides. It died in the flames of burning Shermans and the silence of machine gun nests that had been destroyed by tanks that should not have existed. It died in the transformation of absurdity into tactical fact, of engineering desperation into operational advantage. The DD Shermans were never elegant. They were never technically superior to German armor in conventional metrics, but they were profoundly, brutally sufficient for their moment. They floated when they needed to float. They fought when they reached the beach, and they changed the equation of amphibious warfare in ways that German defensive doctrine could not accommodate, because that doctrine assumed rational engineering and refused to account for the democratic genius of making do with imperfect solutions at overwhelming scale, the irony that would only become fully apparent in the years following Normandy was that German engineers had been correct in their technical assessment of the DD Sherman's limitations. The canvas screens were fragile. The freeboard was minimal. The sea-keeping qualities were marginal at best. In any rough water, the loss rate approached or exceeded 50%. The DD Sherman was, by every conventional metric of naval architecture and armored vehicle design, a marginal system that should not have worked. But war is not an engineering exam graded by technical elegance. War is a practical examination graded by outcomes, by objectives taken or lost, by lives saved or spent. And by that measure, the DD Sherman was a profound success because it solved a specific problem that mattered more than any theoretical limitation. It got armor onto defended beaches during the critical opening phase of amphibious assault. Not reliably, not with acceptable loss rates by peacetime standards, but sufficiently. And sufficiency, when deployed at scale with American industrial capacity behind it, was enough. The German response to the DD Sherman's success at Normandy followed predictable patterns. Initial battlefield reports were dismissed as exaggerations or misidentifications. Surely the tanks had launched from closer range. Surely they had used some conventional method of waterproofing rather than actually floating. When the evidence became undeniable, when German engineers examined captured DD Shermans and interviewed prisoners who had crewed them, the reaction shifted from dismissal to a kind of grudging, irritated respect. The modifications were indeed crude. The system was indeed marginal, but it had worked, and it had contributed to the Allied success at establishing a beachhead that German counterattacks could not dislodge. In the critique sessions and after-action analyses that followed Germany's defensive failures, some voices argued that German engineering culture had become too rigid, too committed to technical perfection at the expense of pragmatic sufficiency. The Tiger tank was superior to the Sherman in every measurable way, but Germany produced fewer than 2,000 Tigers, while America produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. The quality versus quantity debate that had always existed in German military circles took on new urgency as the tide of American materiel began to overwhelm German tactical skill and technical superiority. But these debates were already academic exercises conducted by men who could see the trajectory of the war tilting inevitably toward defeat. The DD Sherman was not the reason Germany lost the war. That outcome was determined by strategic overreach, industrial imbalance, and the combined might of Allied powers mobilized for total war. But the floating tank became a symbol of something that German military culture had failed to adequately account for: the American genius for pragmatic engineering, for accepting imperfect solutions delivered at scale, for winning through overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical elegance. For the men who crewed the DD Shermans, the technical debates were irrelevant. They had ridden absurdity into combat and survived or died according to probability and skill and random chance. Some became bitter about the loss rates, about friends who drowned inside tanks that sank miles from shore, about a system that accepted 30% failures as an acceptable price for tactical advantage. Others felt a peculiar pride in having operated the strangest, most unlikely weapon system of the war, the tanks that floated that shouldn't have worked, that violated every principle of armored warfare and naval architecture and common sense. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, recovering in a British hospital from his burns and concussion, wrote a letter to his mother in Wisconsin that captured something essential about the experience. "We rode the damnedest contraption into France, a tank that floated like a bathtub, only not as well. I watched good men drown in machines that the Germans said couldn't work. But we got to the beach, Mom. We got to the beach when it mattered, and we gave cover fire for the infantry, and maybe that's what saved them. I don't know if it was a good idea or a terrible one, but it was our idea, and we made it work because there wasn't any other choice. That absence of choice, that necessity of making impossible solutions, work through sheer determination and industrial capacity, this was the American contribution to the Allied victory that German military culture could observe but never fully replicate. The German military excelled at fighting with limited resources, at maximizing the effectiveness of each weapon system, at tactical brilliance that compensated for material deficiency. But they were fighting an opponent that had industrialized sufficiency itself, that could afford to accept 30% loss rates on experimental systems because they could build enough to make the remaining 70% decisive. The DD Sherman never became a standard weapon system. After Normandy, most were converted back to conventional armor or retired from service. The specialized amphibious tanks that followed, The LVTs and Amtraks of the Pacific Island campaigns used different engineering approaches, different compromises between buoyancy and firepower. The canvas screen and compressed air propulsion system that Nicholas Straussler had developed in a Newcastle warehouse became a footnote in military history, remembered mainly by specialists and veterans who had personal reason to care about the details. But the symbolic weight of the floating tank persisted. In German military memoirs and technical histories, the DD Sherman appeared again and again as an example of Allied resourcefulness, of the willingness to embrace unconventional solutions, of the danger inherent in dismissing enemy capabilities based on technical assessment alone. The tanks that German engineers had mocked for their absurdity had contributed to the liberation of Western Europe. The technical limitations that seemed so obvious in design review had proven less important than tactical timing and operational necessity. Years later, in the quiet of post-war analysis, some former German officers would reflect on what the DD Sherman revealed about the fundamental difference between German and Allied approaches to military problem-solving. The Germans sought optimal solutions, technically superior systems that reflected the best understanding of military science and engineering principles. The Allies, especially the Americans, sought sufficient solutions that could be deployed at scale, accepting higher loss rates and technical compromises in exchange for overwhelming material advantage and flexibility. Neither approach was inherently superior. In a different war against different opponents, the German emphasis on technical excellence might have proven decisive. But against an opponent with American industrial capacity, Soviet manpower, and British determination all aligned against them, technical superiority became a trap, a commitment to perfection that consumed resources and time that Germany could not afford to spend. The canvas screen that had seemed so absurd to German engineers in 1943 became, in retrospect, a symbol of the Allied victory itself, crude, improbable, marginally functional, but ultimately sufficient when deployed in overwhelming numbers against defenses that had prepared for a different kind of battle. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall to defeat conventional amphibious assault. The Allies had responded by making amphibious assault unconventional, by floating tanks and laying portable harbors and inventing the logistics and specialized systems that conventional doctrine said were impossible. And so the floating tanks entered history not as technical marvels but as practical solutions to an immediate problem, as examples of desperate innovation becoming tactical advantage, as symbols of the democratic genius for making do with imperfect tools when perfect solutions were unavailable or unaffordable. They floated across the English Channel on the morning of June 6, 1944, carrying their crews toward beaches where German defenders waited with confidence, built on technical superiority and tactical doctrine. The canvas screens collapsed, the propellers churned. The 75mm guns traversed toward targets, and in those first hours of the longest day, absurdity proved sufficient. The German engineers who had laughed at the floating tanks were not fools. They were competent professionals, making assessments based on rational analysis and documented experience. Their mockery was justified by every principle of naval architecture and armored vehicle design. They were correct in every technical detail and wrong about the only thing that mattered, that in war, sufficient solutions deployed at scale will always defeat superior solutions that arrive in insufficient numbers or at the wrong moment. The DD Sherman floated against probability, against elegance, against the knowing certainty of men who understood the mathematics of displacement and the limits of canvas and compressed air. It floated, and then it fought, and in fighting, it contributed to a victory that reshaped the world, that ended one form of tyranny and created the conditions for a half-century of cold peace. The technical details became footnotes. The mockery became silence, and the floating tanks took their place in history as symbols of something more profound than engineering, the stubborn determination of free peoples to solve impossible problems with imperfect means, to accept loss and failure and keep advancing, to make the absurd functional through sheer refusal to acknowledge that defeat is rational. On the bluffs above Omaha Beach, where German bunkers have weathered into tourist attractions and memorials mark the places where men died by thousands, the story of the DD Sherman is told to visitors who struggle to imagine tanks floating across 6 miles of open ocean. The story always provokes the same reaction: disbelief, then amazement, then the quiet recognition that history is built on such absurdities, on moments when the impossible becomes necessary and necessity makes it briefly, tragically real. The canvas screens are long gone, rotted or burned or recycled into the vast post-war reconstruction of Europe. The compressed air cylinders have been emptied and discarded. The propeller assemblies have been stripped for scrap. But the idea persists that innovation born of desperation can change the calculus of war. The technical inferiority matters less than operational sufficiency. That laughter is no defense against determination backed by industrial might. The German engineers who mocked the floating tanks lived long enough to see their country divided, their industry destroyed, their technical superiority archived in history books that documented its irrelevance to the war's outcome. Some became bitter, some philosophical, some simply silent, understanding that the great technical achievements of their careers had been deployed in service of evil and had ultimately failed to prevent defeat at the hands of opponents they had dismissed as technically inferior. The Americans who crewed the DD Shermans grew old with memories of riding canvas and compressed air into combat, of watching friends drown inside tanks that promised buoyancy and delivered graves, of firing 75mm shells at concrete bunkers from platforms that shouldn't have existed. They told their stories with the mixture of pride and irony that veterans reserve for experiences that tested them beyond normal human limits. They gathered at reunions and traced the route from England to France on maps that could never capture the terror of those minutes wallowing through rough seas in machines that redefined the boundary between function and failure. And sometimes, in the quiet of late nights when memory refused to settle, they wondered what the German engineers had thought in those first moments when tanks emerged from the sea itself, whether there had been confusion or fear, or the sudden terrible realization that their certainty had been misplaced, that the technical assessment that seemed so obvious had missed something fundamental about the nature of the war they were fighting. The DD Sherman was never the best tank. It was never the most reliable or the most elegant or the most technically impressive. But on a grey morning in June 1944, on a beach in Normandy, where the fate of Western Europe balanced on the actions of a few thousand men in the first hour of battle, it was enough. And sufficiency, delivered at the right moment, is its own form of genius, crude and desperate and beautiful in its pragmatic disregard for the impossibilities that reasonable men would never attempt. The floating tanks floated. They fought, they died or survived, and they changed history in ways that technical superiority could not prevent, proving once more that war is not decided by the perfection of weapons, but by the will of peoples and the capacity of nations to mobilize everything, genius and foolishness, elegance and desperation, technical excellence and crude sufficiency, in pursuit of victory that cannot be achieved through any single virtue alone.